Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I have been extremely busy with school, work, church, baseball, and actually some video projects for this channel, so bear with me. Now, over spring break, I was able to go to Alabama with my friend Andrew. We chased down the M&M Subdivision, which runs from Montgomery down to Mobile. Now, it's old L&N trackage and still sees quite a few trains a day, so that's what this video is all about, and I hope you guys enjoy.
Montgomery would be home base for us as we'd arrive on the afternoon of March 18th, 2026, after a solid 7-hour drive from Tampa. The line Andrew and I would be here to see would be the old L&N main line between here and Mobile, the M&M, named after the two Alabama towns that begin with the letter M. We'd start at the very north end of the M&M upon arrival at Control Point Coosa Street, where a high yellow approach aspect would be lit for a yard job coming out of the yard. Looking to our north is S&N Yard, Montgomery's main yard in town and the beginning of the M&M for southbound trains. Here at the yard just north of downtown is the junction between the M&M and the A&WP subdivisions, the junction that we're staring at and what the Coosa Street signals protect. The M&M is the continuation of the main line from Birmingham south, starting up there as the S and NA South sub and becoming the M&M here at Montgomery Yard's north end. The second line is the A&WP main line that comes out of Atlanta and ends at Coosa Street after running parallel to the M&M and S&N Yard for a few hundred feet. Built as the Atlanta and West Point Railroad, A&WP for short, the main line comes south out of Atlanta and runs all the way here, south by west to Montgomery via LaGrange. There's a small yard here on the A&WP named Chester, which is primarily used for overflow traffic from the nearby S&N Yard and to stage and hold trains that need to head into town via the frenzy of junctions and tracks that can be blocked for hours at a time by other trains. As I said, this A&WP line from Atlanta connects to the M&M main line at CP Coosa Street, although as we'll see soon, there are a couple of transfer tracks that trains use to go between the two main lines within yard limits, built after the many mergers of the late 20th century. At one time, the M&M was L&N trackage, and the A&WP the Western Railway of Alabama, and later the Seaboard, all fierce competitors in the southeast. Just around the corner from Coosa Street and the now combined main lines curve to the southwest through Montgomery's historic Riverside downtown, before reaching Bell Street, the next signaled control point, and another junction, this time with 4 different lines all branching out. With the M&M continuing south through town, the Prattville branch breaks out first to the north, which runs east a handful of miles to Prattville, where several customers reside along the 10-mile-per-hour spur. Between the Prattville and the M&M is the Selma Sub, the old Western Railroad of Alabama route to Selma, Alabama. This continuation of the XXB milepost runs all the way to Myrtlewood, Alabama, on the west end of the state, where it connects to the CPKC. That sub only sees a couple of trains a day, but word is new intermodal service down the CPKC will bring signals and track upgrades to the old main line, and a welcomed increase in traffic volume. Next up is our M&M line to Mobile. Next to the track to the far right here, the Dothan Sub, which is the end of the bow line out of Waycross. This line, shaped like an upside-down bow, was ACL's only route into Montgomery, running from Waycross's Rice Yard to Thomasville as the Thomasville Sub, before becoming the Dothan Sub from there to here in Montgomery. It's not a crazy busy line, but it's still a route that CSX maintains as a main line, and one that we all hope will soon get busier and busier, as CSX shows signs of track upgrades and a potential signal system. Replacing Tuscaloosa as the state's capital city in 1846, Montgomery is one big junction town, and the third most populated city in the state behind Huntsville and Birmingham. Originally a trading post way back in 1785, the Alabama River would prove to be vital for Montgomery's growth as it became a small port town and eventually grew to a large junction town with the arrival of the railroads. Working your way south into town from the A&WP sub, you'll pass Chester Yard, where a set of CSX CM44s would be idling as they waited on permission from the Montgomery Yardmaster to enter the yard via the engine shop transfer track, called the Western Lead. Although power will always reside in the engine shops just south of the yard, Chester does originate a couple of locals each day, still vital to keeping things moving around here in Montgomery. This was, at one point, the northern terminus of the famed Western Railroad of Alabama, and although that name hasn't existed for many years now, there are still some eerie remnants of the railway separate from the L&N and the Seaboard just south of Chester. After crossing over the SL Spur on a slow-speed diamond, you'll reach a fenced-off field that still hosts the remains of the Western Railroad of Alabama's engine shops. This was the location of the rest of Chester Yard, once dozens of tracks wide with car repair facilities and a turntable on the west end. now completely taken over once more by nature. An old coaling tower is all that remains around where the turntable would have stood. These towers, seen everywhere in the 20th century, were used to load coal into steam engines and their tenders, now almost completely gone from this country's railroad scene as steam would give way to diesel-powered locomotives. To the south of the coaling tower are more remains of the WRRA's glory days, with a 2-story yard office still standing for who knows how much longer. Back in the day, this structure was one of many buildings operated by the WRRA and probably housed yardmasters, crew-based facilities, and even sleeping quarters for full-time employees. Now gutted by the city, the WRRA's brick engine shops is the largest remnant still standing, briefly used as an event venue by the city after its railroad years, now completely vacant, fenced off, and abandoned for good. Coming by the old towers on the old WRRA main line would be that yard power we saw at Chester, now with permission into the yard via that western lead. As we covered, this line connects to the M&M and other lines at Coosa and Bell Street, and with those connection tracks to the S&N yard and the engine shops, make it a busy yard entrance, seen earlier in the afternoon with the arrival of local L882 from Prattville. Now returning from that Prattville branch with a handful of cars for S&N yard here, L882 would be using that western lead to enter the yard and drop their engines off at the shop. From the air, it's easy to see how compact everything is here in Montgomery. Just to the east of the main lines is the location of the old WRRA shops, with the engine shops between the two main lines, all bordered by the Alabama River to the left. There's a plethora of industries between the yards too, with several steel manufacturers and scrap yards filling up the vacant space between the two subdivisions. Most of these businesses are still rail served via yard jobs that use spurs that break right out from the yard. Decades ago, most of the businesses moved up here from downtown to give way to gentrification, as downtown Montgomery looks to become a new and improved metropolis, a goal that's already partially completed, as we'll soon see. 2 miles to the north, and we've relocated to the north end of Montgomery Yard, where through freight M524 for Nashville would be doubling out. This train originates in Mobile and runs the M&M up to the yard, where we've caught them now. When all work here is complete, a Montgomery crew will take the train to Birmingham before heading into Tennessee to Nashville's Radnor Yard. We're set up now on the parallel street overpass that flies sparse vehicle traffic over the north side of the yard. Said traffic is mostly crew vans, railroad high railers, and the occasional truck leaving a grain elevator down the road. Another industry that's rail served, and one visible over the thick forest from the overpass's vantage. We'd stick around as a yard job with 2 SD40s would go on duty and promptly get to work here, pulling by and then backing down to head to track 19, where a large cut of cars would be waiting for them. From there, the crew would back everything into the main yard, using every bit of their combined EMD horsepower to do so. From the looks of it, most of these cars would be loaded, which would put these 2 6-axle workhorses to the test. With our light fading fast, we head out for dinner and a night of rest before getting up bright and early the next morning, starting right where we left off, now just south, back in downtown. As previously mentioned, downtown Montgomery is on the come-up, flanked by numerous museums recalling the days of the city's impactful civil rights leaders on the east and the Alabama River to the west. The old Union Station and City Center blocks are in the middle. There's plenty to see and do around here. Andrew and I would start back at Coosa Street, just around the corner, now on the other side of the sharp curve that we were at last night. Here at the crossing for the Riverwalk and Event Pavilion at Coosa, one can get a good look at Union Station, a once busy rail station that hosted dozens of passenger trains a day. Built in 1898 by the L&N, the grand brick structure was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1973, becoming a national landmark in '76. 3 years later, in 1979, passenger service would cease as Amtrak would abandon the Midwest to Florida market, yet the city would maintain it nonetheless, currently the home of the city's Welcome Center and Museum. The large white track shed is still in place and acts as a covering parking lot now, where once many tracks would hold outbound passenger trains underneath the stained glass windows that still exist today. Union Station is by far the largest old railroad relic that makes up the skyline in town, yet just to the east are the old Western Railroad of Alabama's freight house and offices, now bordering the AA baseball team Montgomery Biscuits historic field. Not only is the stadium about 90% old railroad construction, but it's also home of the Tampa Bay Rays' Double-A team. I mean, what else could you ask for? Unfortunately for us, the season for these future Rays starts in a couple of weeks, so we'd only get to explore the outside of the stadium, one that still bears the proud name of the WRRA directly behind home plate, literally set in stone. Running just feet behind the outfield concourse is CSX, who'd show up this morning with local L881, bound for the Dothan Sub. Waiting for L881 at Bell Street would be yet another M524, Mobile to Nashville freight, who'd get signals to enter Montgomery Yard as soon as the 881 would clear. We'd swoop around the corner to the crossing at West Railroad Street as the train would come into view. As 524 would enter, L697, another southbound local, would begin their work and slowly start creeping out of the yard. We'd catch the tail end of 524 enter and scurry over the quarter mile to the A and WP side at Court Street, where the crew would soon cross to pull by and back into Chester Yard. This local, L697, is designated as the southbound Montgomery to Pensacola shuttle drop, taking traffic from both Montgomery and Chester Yards to the Florida Gulf and Atlantic Railroad, which now operates the old Tallahassee line from Pensacola to Baldwin. Although the freight on that line isn't as heavy as in previous years, the FGAR still sees this shuttle from Montgomery and turn job L694 to Mobile every day, with this morning's L697 being a massive one, with over 8,000 feet of freight for Florida's Panhandle. Around the corner at Wright Brothers Park, one can set up on the high ground above the river level main line and get a good look at the old station and canopy, now from the west side, as traffic on the double-tracked main line passes by underneath. 697 would be all the way out here as they picked up their last few cars in Chester Yard this morning, pulling up to Bell Street and then slowly backing in to couple and eventually pick up their conductor before departing south. In just a moment, 697 would call the dispatcher and let him know that they'd be ready to go down to Pensacola, which would take them down the M&M to Flomaton, where the line to Pensacola breaks out to the south. We'd follow suit of the southbound freight and head down the M&M to the outskirts of Montgomery to McGeehee's, where a 6,875-foot siding remains from the L&N days, and the location for a meet of sister trains with our southbound L697 and L698, northbound traffic from Pensacola to Montgomery. The siding here is way too short for L697, so even though he'd get here first, the dispatcher would leave him on the main line, as L698 would approach from the south. Just over a mile south, and we've driven into the thick forests of southern Alabama that protect shady meadows and lazy cattle farms all along the M&M to the marshlands and bayous of Mobile. In the siding is the end of that 698, soon to be passed by train M521, Nashville to New Orleans freight behind a trio of motors. Running between Nashville's Radnor Yard and New Orleans, this is one of many freights that New Orleans receives daily, with plenty of traffic behind the mixture of CSX locomotives. This M&M Sub connects to Mobile, which is then connected to New Orleans by the M&M Sub, making this stretch of main line CSX's only access way into Louisiana and the Crescent City. Moments after 521 was out of the way, a restricting signal would light up for a northbound now, who'd meet the 521 further south on the line. So we'd move south as well to the distant to McGehee signal, a few miles down the right-of-way. When many think of Alabama, places like Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, and Talladega may come to mind, and while those are fairly busy and large cities, the majority of the state looks just like this. Alabama is well known for its lumber, as the national forests here are thick, dense, and produce some of our nation's finest timber, product that would partially lure the railroads into the states in the mid-1800s. Today, these forests still surround much of the urban development around the state's sporadic cities and line the thousands of acres of farmland that produce cotton, peanuts, soybeans, and corn. Thanks to Mr. George Washington Carver, the locals learned how to grow in the sandy and alkaline soils, and most of the M&M follows closely next door to these lush fields. Andrew and I would enjoy the peaceful fields this warm afternoon, as soon enough the signal would light up here, meaning our northbound train was in the block just to our south.
606, lead engine 1836 CHE. It's all right. They're stopping us up here again for a minute.
Calling as M606 out of New Orleans, this one would be led by CSX's RF&P Heritage Unit, number 1836. I've seen this locomotive on many occasions now, yet it's always a thrill to have one lead, as seen today on point of this Waycross-bound train. Like many cities that railroads serve, New Orleans is a mixed bag of merchandise, with plenty of boxcar traffic between chemical tanks, cement hoppers, and long strings of empty auto racks. Hearing that a coal train would be waiting for this M606 at the south end of Montgomery's double track at Control Point Katoma, we'd stay put. Although there's no coal-fired power plant in Mobile, coal trains are commonplace on the M&M, as CSX and Norfolk Southern both run to McDuffie Island, just south of downtown Mobile, where these trains are unloaded to fill up barges. This rail-to-ship terminal is part of the gigantic Port of Mobile and is one of the U.S.'s largest coal export terminals. In just a few days along the M&M, it'll soon be apparent how valuable coal traffic here is for the CSX. We'd soon leave the old signal here at McGehee's in favor of following our coal train south a few miles to Fort Deposit, where the afternoon light would yield a great shot with the settlement's water tower. Incorporated in 1891 after being built as a U.S. fort under Andrew Jackson, Fort Deposit is only home to around 1,000 people now, with a quiet and partially abandoned downtown strip that's separated from the thinly spread neighborhoods by the M&M. Many old industries in town have been sold or gone bankrupt, making for a peaceful yet empty grid this Thursday afternoon, as the old L&N crossings would activate for C240. Fort Deposit is also interesting as it's the climax of a steep grade that begins at Ledohatchee to our north and raises the tracks onto the high ground at the fort.
CSX detector milepost 520.5.
We'd attempt to follow the train south a little more as the crew would conquer the grade and glide down towards Greenville. That was our next spot, where a couple of traffic lights and lousy drivers would make catching the head end impossible. Oh well. Built in 1923 by the L&N, Greenville's Central Depot is now part of the West Commerce Street Historical District in town, now repurposed after a 1990 restoration as office space. It's always good to see towns using their old depots in the present day, with Greenville being one of only a few left on the M&M. With C240's coal loads going south, the empties would come out from Mobile from a previous train in the prior days, now symboled as E248, meeting that C240 in the Wilcox double track just south of Evergreen. Knowing that we'd have some time to play around with before our northbound would get to us, we'd drive around and land on Searcy as our photo spot. With the house track located here at Old Stage Road Crossing, we're at milepost 000-525.8 in the middle of Searcy siding. Searcy is the third siding south on the M&M south from Montgomery at 2.1 miles long, plenty big enough for all the trains that currently run this line. With no southbounds near, however, the signals would illuminate high green for empty coal train E248, who'd be rounding the S-curve here with a mile-long string of empties. One characteristic we'd notice on these Mobile coal trains would be the cut of rock hoppers on the head end. I'm not sure if these are actually for rock delivery or being used for coal service, but if anyone is familiar with the reasoning, please let me know down in the comments. It's a new sight for me and Andrew, and one that we'll see many more times in this video. E248 would continue south towards Temerson as we'd break off for dinner and finally back to Montgomery once more. We'd end up back at Railroad Street, next to what we've nicknamed the Railcar Playground, where an unnamed scrap dealer is currently tearing apart a few cars, probably bad orders from the yard next door. In just a few minutes, local L882 would come in from the Prattville branch with another short train for Montgomery, tonight coming in onto the M&M and throwing the switch at the engine shop lead here at the crossing to enter the yard. A82 would have orders to drop his engines at the shop, as a yard job would come in and pick up his train there, so we'd depart for the house as we'd lose our last little bit of light. We'd be up early again as Andrew would steer the truck south down US 31 towards Flomaton. We're well south of where we were yesterday on the M&M, currently coming into the community of Bruton. By far one of the coolest towns on the line, Bruton's main storefronts and downtown strip are split in half by the M&M, as track speed briefly drops to 30 as trains tear through town. At Bruton, there's a lumber company, a signaled 5,500-foot siding, and a house track, one that local L673 will commonly use during the week, yet not today. That's the Flomaton-based local that runs up and down the M&M on weekday mornings, currently at the giant Georgia Pacific paper mill a couple miles south of town. With nothing lined through and only switching on the radio now, we'd move south from Bruton to the next town, at Pollard. During the Civil War, this sleepy residence was home to Camp Pollard, a Confederate Army base that utilized this M&M Sub to supply goods to and from Montgomery. After a series of Mobile-bound attacks, Pollard was found abandoned in 1864 by Union troops and ended up getting burned to the ground later on. After the war, the community was revitalized with new construction and the rebuilding of the Alabama and Florida Railroad, which Charles T. Pollard founded and later titled the town. Nowadays, Pollard is home to 120, all overseen by their silver water tower, one that you can frame with the M&M as trains like G310 fly by underneath.
CSX impact detector milepost 601.39. Track 1 northbound. No defects. Repeat, no defects. Total axle count 378. Impact detector out.
Coming out of a sunrise departure from Mobile, G310 is bound for Evansville today, with 5,000 feet of grain empties led by a solo GEVO. These are some of the most interesting trains to catch, as they're almost completely made up of fallen flag railroad hoppers, some from around here and some from across the country. It would only take G310 a couple of minutes to clear the defect detectors here at Pollard, as we'd continue south with the approach of that L673, now finishing up at the paper mill and coming back to Flomaton. At milepost 605 are the distant to Flomaton signals, with track 1 being special, with notable old safe train variants on the job. Since track 1 combines with track 2 at the north end of the double track at Welka, this two-headed, two-light signal is all that's needed, soon lighting up to an approach medium with the arrival of L673 and the approach of M606 from the south. With a handful of cars from Georgia Pacific, L673 would come south, now only 2 miles away from Flomaton, where this crew's day will end. The L&N initially maintained this yard as it's where the Pensacola line would intersect, now CSX, and still intact with a few yard tracks, yard office, and original double track. That second main line would be made good this morning, as meeting that 673 around the corner would be M606, northbound from New Orleans with freight for Waycross, led by a couple of GE wide cabs, Elephant style. Working Seibert Yard in Mobile and S&N Yard in Montgomery on its way north, 606 is a morning staple through this area, today running with a long string of auto racks, all empties, returning north to the markets and ports along the East Coast. With Flomaton being just a stone throw away, that's where we'd go next. Incorporated in 1908, Flomaton is just barely in Alabama. In fact, the south end of the Y here is actually in Florida, hence the settlement's name, a mix of Florida, Alabama, and town. Flomaton was once built around the railroad and has been a junction town since 1869, as the Alabama and Florida Railroad would build right through before being bought by the L&N in 1880. Originally built as the Pensacola Railroad from here to Pensacola, both lines were then to become the L&N, before ending up under CSX by 1986. Here at the junction, CSX's PD Subdivision branches from the M&M and milepost 000607 on the M&M main line, and OOK 607 for the PD. Starting at the bottom of the Y, the PD Subdivision runs 40 miles south to Golding Yard in Pensacola, where CSX interchanges with the Florida Gulf and Atlantic. It sees a handful of trains a day, bound for the FGAR, or coming from there, going both ways up the M&M towards Montgomery or Mobile. Of note at Flomaton are the old R2 signals, still in place and still earning their keep for the railroad. It's not common to see these along Class 1 main lines anymore, so we'd make sure to grab a few shots of them before we'd leave the area. South from Flomaton, and you'll instantly cross the state line into Florida on US 29. The route follows the PD Sub closely on its way south, a route that we take to get down to the settlement of McDavid, where more old L&N concrete mileposts reside, and where we'd await the approaching northbound from Pensacola. In a few minutes, local L698 would crest the hill and into view with a lengthy train from Montgomery today. Since the train would still be about 14 miles south of Flomaton at this point, the crew would stay at track speed up until the final few yards at the junction, making for an interesting chase back into Alabama. Andrew and I would luckily beat the train back to Flomaton, where we'd set up in the middle of the Y along Flomaton Road. 698 would appear shortly later, calling out a slow approach as they'd bend from the PD Sub northbound onto the M&M, now with a clear main line to Montgomery.
5372 northbound.
Like we covered yesterday, L698 is the Pensacola to Montgomery local, today needing 2 GEs to make the trip, as the crew would be assigned to a sizable train out of Golding Yard. I assume on weekdays, this train begins its day down in Pensacola when the morning FGAR train arrives from the east. After briefly switching with Pensacola's yard job, 698 heads out around lunchtime, making it to us at 3:30 this afternoon, although time slots certainly change, as they always do with freight railroads. We'd hear a couple of trains that were to follow the L698 to Montgomery, so back up US 31 we'd go, turning west from Flomaton towards Wabeek and Canoe, landing at the latter siding with a high green and an approaching headlight. Racing northbound towards Flomaton would be M602, another New Orleans to Waycross freight, and one that we'd chase all the way back to Flomaton, departing canoe just seconds after the head end would pass. A quick 180 and we're back on US 31, catching up to the power of 602 in just a couple of minutes, as we'd both need to slow down as we'd approach Flomaton. Amidst after-school traffic in town, we'd beat the train back to the junction by a few minutes, giving us enough time to get my favorite shot of the day, as 602 rolls through, passing the old Track 2 R2 in the process. .602 would roll on with his sizable train, with orders to pick up the pace, as train E244 would follow right behind him, after both trains' afternoon departure from Mobile. More rock on the head end, and this coal train is once more passing history on the main line, with empties for Temerson, just outside of Birmingham, where sizable coal deposits still reside along CSX's Birmingham Mineral Sub, a line that's responsible for much of Mobile's export traffic, and one that never sleeps, pumping out a number of trains a week and receiving the same. With our northbound parade gliding into the distance, Andrew and I would break off shortly for lunch, returning to a medium clear aspect at the south leg of the Y here at Flomaton, a scene only possible once a day. L674 would be approaching, a Pensacola to Mobile and back turn job, and currently the only train that takes this southern connection to head south on the M&M. In moments, 674 would appear to our delight, with a couple more GEs hauling yet another big train from Pensacola. From Flomaton, traffic on the M&M would come to a grinding halt, as our earlier party of northbounds would all meet southbound train M605, a meet and process that would take upwards of 2 hours for whatever reason. We'd start heading back north to Montgomery during all of this, settling in Castleberry, north of Bruton, for our last shot of the day. Still known as the strawberry capital of Alabama, Castleberry was first established as a railroad stop along the Alabama and Florida Railroad, now the M&M. Like many small towns of the time, Castleberry would rise around the main lines with storefronts and a quaint downtown being constructed as strawberry and agriculture exporting would create growth and economic stability for residents and employees. When the sandy soil finally ran out of its God-given nutrients, farming moved elsewhere, and Castleberry's glory days were over. As if to add insult to injury, the town faced major financial ruin after over-investing in its minimal police department, creating a controversial speed trap along Route 31. Like Waldo and Lottie along the Florida S-Line, state legislation soon put the police out of business, acting as the final nail to Castleberry's coffin. The town still hosts an annual strawberry festival and is called home by over 400 residents. It's the location of a 2.2-mile-long siding, one that M605 would be smoking by tonight, with a piercing EMD leader whose horn would echo off the abandoned downtown. We'd be up before the sun once again on our final day along the M&M, as sunrise would find us in Fort Deposit, now set up for a northbound, who'd be flying down the grade towards Lido-Hatchie, waking up the borough in the process. It's M520, coming out of a midnight departure from New Orleans, arriving in town just moments before the clock strikes 7 a.m., with freight for Nashville.
CSX detector, milepost 520.5. CSX detector, milepost 520.5. No defects. Repeat, no defects. Total axles 562. Detector out.
No defects this morning for M520 is the last we'd hear in Fort Deposit, as we'd steer south once more into the rising sun and into Georgiana. Georgiana is the site of Georgiana siding for CSX and the interchange with the Three-Notch Railroad, a short line that runs from here south by east to Andalusia, where a handful of customers still reside about a 30-mile trek from our location. With still a handful of customers along the M&M around here, CSX maintains a petite yard office where local L671 starts its day. They'd have to hold for a few minutes, as coming up from Mobile would be yet another coal train, labeled E240 for Temerson, from the docks at Alabama's Port City. In moments, 671 would start their morning dance of backing past the connection switch and getting permission from the dispatcher to open up the switch in the siding and come onto the main line at Georgiana's north end. They'd have a quick pickup north on the line at Chapman this morning, where Boise Cascade operates a sizable lumber mill and manufacturing plant. Two empties would be all 671 would have to grab today, ahead of another northbound freight from Mobile. First developed in the 1850s, Georgiana was incorporated in 1872, after the railroad would come to town and directly dip into the area's rich forests. Georgiana is firmly built along Alabama's Red Hills region, often referred to as the state's Black Belt, known for its rich black soil. The soil would raise the best timber around, a valuable commodity for the A&F and later the L&N, as the yard would soon be built here. Many will recognize Georgiana as well for country music star Hank Williams' birthplace and childhood town. His house is now a museum filled with memorabilia and plenty of history, located just down the street from the main line here. A main line that would soon get busy once more, as M606 would call in the distance.
M606, 21 engine, full name, Georgiana, Northbound.
Rolling up the hill would be M606, with a quartet of engines up front led by AC-44s 492 and 117, sandwiching SD-70 4533 and 5241, bringing up the rear. Even with a combined 12,000 plus horsepower, the train would struggle into town as they'd slow down at the south end while L671 would re-enter the siding. That would give us just enough time to skip back up the line to Chapman, where we'd set up for 606, now at speed again.
So you can get a T7 at Best Buy.
30 minutes along Route 31 and we're back in Pollard, as that L673 would be once again working Georgia Pacific on the south side of Bruton, now ready to return to Flomaton. 673's old SD40, number 8051, would be a prize for Andrew and me, and after catching them reversing yesterday, we'd be back for a redemption shot of the locomotive's interesting front end. Yet even after watching them spin the Y in Flomaton the previous morning, 8051 would reappear long hood forward. Oh well, sometimes that's just the way things go.
SX impact detector milepost 601.39. Track 1 southbound. No defects. Repeat, no defects. Total axle count 158. Impact detector out.
We'd relax in Flomaton for a bit before returning to the M&M, as finally a northbound would appear at lunchtime, when the lighting is good, and in today's case, so would the power. Setting up along one of the many farms around Flomaton, or just west of town between there and Atmore, as X602 would come out from Mobile with a shiny SD70 in the lead. That X symbol denotes an extra move, as this is actually the second 602 train of the day. The previous M602 just ran way early, before we could make a track stop. Usually these X trains are just extra traffic that missed the earlier freight, and may make the next day's freight a bit too long. Either way, it always yields an extra train, a welcome occurrence. Across from the fields of peanuts and soybeans, we'd watch as the land would be tilled shortly after 602's passing. On this hot spring afternoon, clouds of dust would fill the air, making for quite the scene, and one I'll think of next time I'm at the store buying produce. These are the people, the land, and the crop that feed our country and keep it moving. Between this and the railroad, Andrew and I would decide to stay put, as L674 would round the bend at Flomaton and come south towards Mobile, passing us here at the field momentarily. .674 wouldn't be much of a train today, rolling by the small siding of Waubee just to our north between here and Flomaton, set to meet a northbound at Canoe, the next siding south. So that's where Andrew and I would turn the wheel. The only issue, the northbound was way closer than we thought, so a U-turn and a trip back to Waubee as yet another empty coal train rolls north, doing every little bit of track speed as they approach Flomaton. With nothing else lined for the next couple of hours, we'd push west towards Atmore, where after a short drive around the town would reveal a Burlington Northern caboose in downtown. Atmore is where the M&M passes under the old Burlington Northern as they go from Amory, Mississippi to Pensacola. It's now the Alabama and Gulf Coast Railroad, another Genesee and Wyoming company that interchanges with BNSF at the line's north end. Although BN Green hasn't passed through here in decades, it would still be a treat to see it maintained by the city and open to all who pass by. Further west, we'd pull into the town of Perdido, as a green signal would halt us with the approach of our last northbound of the trip. This is M520, rounding the bend as they'd head north in fading light, and a train that we'd follow towards Montgomery and the house. It wouldn't be easy for us to keep up with them, as we'd have to slow for Atmore and its frenzy of poorly timed traffic lights. Alas, we'd beat the train to Canute, where one last field shot would await in the final minutes of sundown. 520 would slow for Flomaton as we'd leap ahead once more, now entering Bruton ahead of the train. We'd make up our minds earlier in the day to catch something going by here, so even after the light had given way to the night, Bruton's downtown would brighten the scene as M520 cruises through. North on Route 31 and we're back in Castleberry, where a meet would be set between 520 and southbound M605 for New Orleans. As 520 took the siding, the signals here at the north end would upgrade to an approach to a high green for 605, who wouldn't be notching up after a slowdown. He'd be flying. Last shot of the trip would come here at Castleberry, as 520 knocks down the medium clear indication, one that will guide him back onto the main line to Montgomery and the end of this cruise shift. This would wrap it up for us, 3 full days around the M&M, and 3 packed with action, I'd say. There's plenty more to see on this line, especially closer to Mobile, so I hope to return soon to see the rest of it. But for now, we pack up and make our way home the following morning. I thank all of you for watching this one. I appreciate all the support recently, and although I've been very busy, there's plenty to come. But until we meet again very soon by the tracks, this is Christian from Multicolor Films. End of transmission.